Namaste, my name is Amish Tripathi and I'm the director of the Nehru Centre, London. Now, some may think of Nehru Centre as just this beautiful fine building, and it is a fine building, no doubt. We have a wonderful art gallery out here. We have an awesome auditorium on the first floor with a capacity of 100 to 120 people right here in the heart of central London in Mayfair. But the Nehru Centre is a lot more than this fine building. The Nehru Centre is also an online platform. We are available on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram and on YouTube. And so the Nehru Centre is actually wherever you want it to be. Of course, we'd love for you to come to the physical events that we organize out here when we do organize them. But do join all our online platforms as well. This is a hybrid world. We are going to have offline physical events and online events as well. So do join our online platforms and do keep giving us feedback of what you think of it. We'd love to host you out there. We'd love to hear what you think of our events, and do keep sending in your suggestions as well. We do keep imbibing and learning from the feedback that you give to us to give you programs that you guys might enjoy. Thank you so much for your kind attention. Namaste. Jai Hind. Namaste. Happy Republic Day to all of you. Ganatantra Divas ki bahut bahut shubhkamnaएं. 2022 is a landmark year for India. Of course, it is the 75th year of our existence as an independent country. But this year, projections show very clearly that at the end of March 2022, India's GDP will cross the GDP of our former colonial master, the UK. I'm sitting in London, UK, and our GDP will cross the UK's GDP as of March 2022. What we lost over a few centuries, we've recovered just within 30 years of post-economic reforms. The next 25 years will be even more exciting. Projections are that by the end of this decade, we should certainly cross Germany and Japan to become the third largest economy. All these economic changes will, of course, have an impact on India's social life, political life, foreign relations. And we couldn't have put together a better panel than the one that's coming up right now to discuss these very exciting and world-changing events that will happen over the next 25 years. So if I may invite the guests that we have for you. First, Amrita Narlikar, who is President Giga and Non-Resident Senior Fellow at the ORF. Namaste, Amrita.
Namaste.
Pleasure having you here. Then Rajeshwari Pillai Rajgopalan, Director, Center for Security and Strategy and Technology at the ORF. Namaste, Rajeshwari ji. Pleasure having you on stage with us.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Ambassador Navdeep Suri, Distinguished Fellow ORF and Senior Retired IFS Officer. I'd met him as an ambassador of the UAE. Pleasure having you here, Navdeep ji.
Pleasure.
C. Raja Mohan, Visiting Professor, Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore, a doyen in the foreign policy space. It's an honor having you on our platform, Raja ji.
Thank you, Amish, for inviting me here.
Thank you. And Adil Zainul Bhai, Chairman at Capacity Building Commission of India and Quality Council of India. Adil ji, thank you so much for placing us.
Pleasure.
And to conduct all these proceedings, my partner in crime, Samir Saran, President of Observer Research Foundation India, who you've seen on our platform on a few occasions. Samir, thank you so much for conducting this event for us.
So, Amish, thank you so much for your partnership. It's always a pleasure to work with the Nehru Centre and put together conversations that in many ways agitate our own progress. And as you rightly pointed out, the next 25 years beckon us. As we celebrate 75 years of independence, as we mark our Republic Day today, ORF put together a series of essays to explore various aspects of the Indian story, looking back and looking ahead. This compilation is available online, and I would request all our viewers to go and read these wonderful essays written by some of the finest minds today. And these are cross-cutting. They look inwards. They look at the Indian economic story, human development aspects, the climate stories, the geopolitical aspects and how we engage with others. It also looks at the digital India and frontiers such as space and emerging technology. And I think this is election, in many ways, is just the beginning of conversations India must have with itself and with others as it charts out its next 25 years, which are really going to be exciting. And to discuss all of this, I think we have some of those authors with us, a very fine panel. And you've already introduced them, Amish. So I will quickly move into the conversation so that we can get the maximum out of this evening. And let me first turn to Adil Zainul, who, besides wearing many hats that you have listed, is also someone who has been deeply engaged with India's evolution over the past 3 to 4 decades in various roles. And I want to ask you, sir, that in your essay that you have written for us, you have stated that digital India today means different things to different people. But for the world, it means that India, with its technology, is here to lead. And my question to you would be that which India do you refer to? Is it the India of the unicorns? And we see this huge startup ecosystem emerging. Is it the India which is changing its life through technology? Is it governance? That where do you see digital India mediate our future?
Samir, thank you so much, and it's a great question because it covers so much ground. So let me start out with saying that digital India has really taken off in the last few years because the infrastructure for a digital India was laid. So today, 99% of the villages in India have 4G connectivity. So if you are a farmer, except in the 1% of the villages, which will get there soon, uh, for the first time, you have access to the world in a way that you didn't have before. You can buy a 5,000 rupee phone, and soon it'll be a 2,000 rupee phone that will have about 70 to 80% of the capability of an iPhone. And on that, in your own language, you can get access to the world, and you can learn, you can transact, you can do whatever it is that you want to do, just as the richest denizens of the world can do. So the time gap between what other people can get and what the poorest person in India can get has shrunk. And because the world is so much happens digitally as opposed through physical goods, a very large proportion of the Indian population is getting access to it as a result of the digital infrastructure that has been laid by this incredible push to get 4G connectivity and broadband connectivity to every village and every individual in India. So the first point is that without that infrastructure, there would be no digital India, right? So we have to have that infrastructure. Then on top of that, I want to talk about two or three aspects, and then we can continue that dialogue later. I won't go on for too long. The first aspect is that India now has been able to develop what I call population scale platforms at startup speed. In the past, we always thought the government would move very slowly, but the scale of our issues are so big, and that's why we call it population scale, but at startup speed. And let me give you a few examples of these, which are leading edge platforms for the world. Of course, the first one where we showed this was Aadhaar, and now everyone's familiar with it, so I won't go into it. But very recently, we've had UPI, which is the interface for transactions, for financial transactions. India currently has over $150 billion worth of transactions happening on that. We have more transactions on that compared to any country other than China. And in a very short period of time, this platform has allowed digital transactions to take off in India in a huge way. It was designed in India, it's run by Indians, it is a population scale program at startup speed. If you look at how CoWIN was developed in India. It now has over 750 million people on it. It is probably one of the best, it's the best platform to track CoWIN vaccines, and soon it will also be able to track tests, etc. India developed it, and we did this in record time. If you look at our National Digital Health Mission, same kinds of things are happening. If you look at the portal called eShram, the goal is to have 400 million people who are laborers in India registered on eShram, and they will be aware. All government benefits would then flow through that digitally without touching, without going through any local administration, etc. So all of a sudden, I would say in the last few years, we've got enormous confidence that in India we can build population scale programs at startup speed. So we don't have to take 10 years to build it. We can build it in 6 months and get it launched. And there are 4 or 5 other such big population scale programs that are about to be launched that were all developed in India using open standards, using Indian programming talent, and they will be available to the rest of the world, which is very interested in getting something like this. If you look at, Amish, I think you are in the UK, you said. If you look at the amount of money that the UK spent in putting the track and trace software program in place, CoWIN was built for 1/100th of that cost. Okay. So that's the second part of the digital. That's the second part of the digital piece that I wanted to talk about. And the third part, so that we don't forget about our wonderful unicorns, is that over a 15-year period, the startup ecosystem in India has changed dramatically. And today it is sort of the largest startup ecosystem after, I would say, the US and China. There are more unicorns in India than any other country except those two. Next year we will have another 30 to 40 more. The amount of venture capital money that's coming into these companies is huge. Every student but more importantly, every student who graduates today is looking forward to this and saying, I want to do, if these guys can do it, I can build something. So it is creating an excitement amongst people to go and start their own business and make it successful. 50% of the unicorns that are coming out now have come out from regional engineering colleges or state colleges. They are not from the IITs and the IIMs. And more of them are going to come from there. More of them are coming from tier 3 and tier 4 towns. So this is a quick overview of digital. Sorry for taking so long, but I want to cover all 3 areas.
No, I think it is very important. The key message from you is the connectivity and information space now is truly democratic and deep. Financial inclusion is now a reality. And of course, platform scale governance delivery is something that we are witnessing in India in recent past. I will come back to you for a second round of question, and I want to leave a thought with you, and I want you to wear your management hat and help design the future. There is also a population scale expectation from government. If everyone is connected, everyone has aspirations, everyone has ambitions, and therefore the pressure on government is likely to increase when more people want to engage with it. And wearing your management hat, looking ahead, what are some of the key governance ideas that we must build into our system to serve the next 25 years of the India story? Let me turn to Raji at this stage. Raji, Dr. Rajeshwari Rajagopalan, Director of Center at ORF that focuses on technology and security and of course strategy. Raji, your paper speaks of India's bridging in the technology domain. But before I ask you to explain that Indian role for technology and for the emerging world, let me ask you, how exciting is the space sector, the outer space sector? That's another India story of the last decade or so. And while we see these multi-billionaires that take a walk down the outer orbit, what does it really mean for a country like us?
No, thank you, Samir. And it's an exciting time in terms of when you look at space tourism, like you said, space mining, new lunar missions are being planned, increasing private sector, not just in the Western context. Private sector was typically a Western phenomena, but that's also changing in the last a decade or so. The Asian countries, whether it is India, China, Japan has been somewhat more pro in this regard. So all of us are getting more excited about what you can do in space, what you can get out of space in a sense. And I think there are also many more countries, especially the developing countries in Asia, are beginning to just appreciate the utility of space and how space can change the lives of the people. So say space has become so important for the social economic development, but also for the security requirements in a sense increasingly. So I think space has become come to become the centerpiece in that sense, in terms of strategy and technology development and so on and so forth. But I think there are also many challenges, including for India, whether it is in terms of space governance, whether in terms of the domestic policy network, but also in terms of the global governance debates. Space debris, the amount of junk that we are creating or have created over the decades, I think that's an important problem that we have to deal with. And if we continue to use space in the manner in which we are doing, some of the, especially the weaponization trends that we are seeing, we may not be able to use space in the longer term, or even in the medium term. Actually, a day without space is something that we need to think about, and especially in the context of the repeated anti-satellite tests that countries have been doing. We ourselves have done one a decade, almost 3 years ago now. But that was, in a sense, we had to demonstrate that capability 3 years ago when India conducted the Mission Shakti, its own anti-satellite test. That was, in a sense, to we were trying to match up to a capability that already exists in the region, China's. So from our perspective, I think the major problems are in terms of what China is doing, what are the what are the strategic consequences of the China's space program? Of course, otherwise, the China's development of the anti-satellite test was the first major wake-up call for India in terms of the challenges that India needs to be prepared to. But some of the other challenges that go somewhat unnoticed are the cyber and electronic warfare in space, development of directed energy weapons. These are the kind of things that really don't get much attention, but at the same time, this is becoming, in a sense, the more preferred way of attacking somebody else's satellites or creating disruptions. Because if you're using a cyber weapon to create satellite disruption, it is going to create only a temporary damage, and therefore countries may not pursue a case against you and so on and so forth. So in a sense, those are so far China has been doing something of this kind against primarily against the US. But I think this is something that India needs to be concerned about. And in fact, I think India is mindful of this particular challenges that is coming about, to the point where the DRDO, the Defense Research and Development Organization chief, went on to say that we are also developing a slew of the counter space capabilities in order to protect our satellites, because we are so invested. If you were to calculate the kind of economic investment, including the ground infrastructure and the services associated with it, we have something to the tune of 35, 37 billion invested in this. So we are socially and economically, and of course security-wise, invested in space, and therefore protecting our space assets is an important task. And I think that's going to drive our policy network. But I think from an Indian perspective, I think we are also facing increasingly a sort of a capacity deficit. ISRO has done very well in terms of especially given the minuscule budget that we work with. It's Chandrayaan mission more than a decade ago. You had the Mangalyaan mission, India's Mars mission, all of which have been very, very successful, and especially at a fraction of the cost which we have done that. But I think given the kind of growing demands that we are seeing, there is a huge demand, and supply is there has been some sort of constraints on that front. And I think therefore, I think we have to open up the private sector. And I think that's something that we are seeing over the last 2 years. The government has spoken about the opening up the private sector, the Indian space sector, so that private players can actually contribute to India's space story. Otherwise, we will be losing out, not only because we will not be able to keep up with our growing demand, but we're also going to be losing out in the global commercial space market. So if India has to get a sizable chunk of the global space market, we have to step up our act, particularly by bringing in the private sector. And
Yes,
India is...
Yes. So you're making a case for private sector. You're making a case for using the entrepreneurial energy of India to deepen our engagement in the sector. Quick question to you. You state that we need to play a bridging role that can, in a sense, narrow the gap between the developing countries and the developed world. Now, in strategic sectors, we have seen more recently, India prefers to play with the chord. It is not necessarily becoming the leader of the trade union. It is taking a more strategic role. How can India do this in the space sector? How do you see India?
Yeah, absolutely. So India is a country that I think many developing countries have looked at with a lot of admiration, because they see as a fellow democratic country that has been developing at a slow pace, but at the same time have been able to make significant scientific achievements, whether in India's nuclear program or in India's space program and so on and so forth. So India, therefore, I think has certain amount of advantages, and it has been attempting to do this play this kind of bridging role. But seriously, I think there are growing challenges. I think the bridging the divide between the developing and the rich countries will become difficult, particularly because China will try to exploit these differences also. China is also trying to step into the same shoe and trying to reach out to these developing countries and creating. So this is a dividing line in the emerging Cold War in a sense. India is in some ways well positioned in because as a developing country, but India is also a rising power. So we have our feet in both camps. But yeah, I think India also has to worry about its own security concerns.
So there
And
is a
therefore, I think it will, in some sense, it will limit our maneuverability in some sense. But I think because driven by the security concerns, we are moving closer to the Quad countries and kind of things. But at the same time, we have this aspiration, we have this ambition to partner with developing countries so that we can also
if we
share
don't
our
do
growth
it, we
stories
leave
there.
a vacuum for China. I think that's the case you're making, that we will
Yes.
have to think of this as a strategic imperative on our end
Absolutely.
to work with the emerging
We
world.
have done some ways. 2014, for instance, for the first time, India talked about the South Asian satellite. Having been a space power for a long time, for several decades, we never did think about, we never really thought about what we can do for the neighboring countries and kind of things. But so at least now we have begun to kind of the space diplomacy which is coming from approaching this from a strategic perspective.
Excellent. So thank you, Raji. And I'll come back to you. Amrita, let me turn to you. Professor Narlikar, I have, you have been writing on multilateralism, you've been writing on global governance, you've been writing on the challenges we face for forever. I've been reading your work and I've been inspired by your writings. Now, one of your trains of thought expressed in the essay that you have written for this volume, Aspirations, Ambitions, and Approaches, India at 75, which is on the screen for the viewers. You suggest that amidst all the hand-wringing, it's often forgotten that the crisis of multilateralism could offer new opportunities that India should harness. What could be these opportunities and what must India do? And as a follow-up, for example, we are seeing the European Union become a new arena of contest and conflict again. Now, in this situation that is emerging and fast evolving, what role could India be doing to strengthen stability or to work towards a global entente in this situation?
Okay, thank you very much, Samir. Excellent questions as always. And may I just say it's a great pleasure to be here with you and to be a part of this excellent collection, very timely collection of essays. And also thank you to Amish for hosting us. So what are the opportunities and what should India do to harness these opportunities in relation to this crisis of multilateralism that we are seeing? And there is indeed a crisis, right? We had President Biden telling us America's back. We had Chancellor Merkel last year saying the prospects for multilateralism are much better than they have been since the last 2 years. But we know this relief was premature. Right, it was extremely premature, in fact, because we have seen the tragedy unfolding in Afghanistan, which is a painful reminder of the failures of multilateralism and missing American leadership. You yourself, Samir, have written about the sins of omission and commission of the World Health Organization. In the World Trade Organization, one of the organizations that I study, we're seeing countries still bickering over trips and other aspects relating to vaccine access, even while COVID is spreading and continues to spread. So multilateralism really is not in the best of health. And really, there are two big problems with it. One, we're facing a much tougher structural context, which is driven by geoeconomics. So the entire post-war multilateral system was built on the assumption that peace and prosperity were inextricably and positively linked. In fact, we know that is now, as it turns out, that's not the case, because we are seeing that countries are able to weaponize those chains of interdependence that were supposed to lead to prosperity and peace, in fact, can be weaponized for strategic purposes, for security purposes. And we saw this happening in the context of vaccine diplomacy, in the context of countries restricting exports of key medical supplies, for instance. We're seeing this in the case of semiconductor chips and so forth, rare earth minerals. There's a whole variety of materials which we know are very important for production, and those value chains can be weaponized. And that's the first big problem of multilateralism. The system as we have it does not work with those assumptions. The system assumes that you have peace and prosperity and they'll go hand in hand together. So more interdependence is a good thing, and it might not be. The second problem is values, right? It's this assumption that we can somehow just tinker with multilateralism, just come up with very technocratic solutions on how do we change decision-making processes. Can we do something about fishery subsidies? Yes, fishery subsidies are extremely important. But we don't ask the question, what is the very purpose of multilateralism? So that's the big crisis. But a crisis is also an opportunity. And India would do well to harness this opportunity for itself, but also for the global community at large. And so let me just give you 3 important opportunities. First, India has always made the case for reforming multilateralism, right? It's talked about how inequitable some of the processes are, how the outcomes turn out to be rather skewed, how developing countries don't have enough voice and are not able to influence outcomes. Now, for the first time, we are seeing a much more serious debate on reform taking place. Not just a box-ticking exercise, because multilateralism looks pretty broken. And there is recognition amongst multiple parties that reform needs to be undertaken. India could play a leading role in this reform process. Second, the great and the good, the powerful players in the multilateral system, be it the P5, be it the Quad, the old Quad in the World Trade Organization, there is increasing recognition that there is a need for allies. And this is especially so in the West, right? I think that might have been the last time we saw each other physically, which was at the Munich Security Conference in 2020, where there was this deep soul searching about Westlessness. There is a real concern about Westlessness and the need for allies to look beyond the obvious and to look at other players in other regions. And India, I would argue, is a potentially extremely important ally, both for the US and the European Union. And third, India has always had a circumspect approach to globalization, right? India has done very well out of trade liberalization, out of its different parts of a liberalization process. But it has always been very critical of rampant globalization. And we saw this play out, for example, in the debate on food security in the World Trade Organization, right? Now, because of weaponized interdependence, because of geoeconomics, India's approach looks much more meaningful than it had done in the past. So for these 3 reasons, I would argue that there are these opportunities, and India is uniquely placed to harness them.
And what should India be doing today with what's happening in Europe? With this new face-off that's underway, what would be your advice to Indian policymakers on what India should be thinking about doing?
Well, as I'm sitting here in Germany, perhaps I could say just one thing about Germany. And because Germany, as you know, has been subject to quite a lot of critique on what's been happening in Ukraine, and there's a lot of debate within Germany on how to deal with China, right? And so here I would argue that these 2 points that I've just made on the crisis of multilateralism. One, there is a problem of reliability of supply chains. And this is one big reason why Germany has been more cautious than a lot of other European countries on how to deal with the problems that are emerging in relation to Ukraine and Russia, right? And that has to do with energy dependence. And so Germany should be taking a long, hard look at its supply chains, and the same goes with China, right? You have a big business lobby that says, well, actually, that's how we've developed our production lines. We don't want to stop trading with China. You see this in some of the big automobile sectors, right? So Germany needs to be at the forefront of these global supply chains and restructuring them. And that's not the language you normally hear in Germany. At best, you hear is diversification, right? And then the second point is values, right? Germany loves to talk about values, but often this is limited to labor standards, environmental standards, which are important, right? But there are also macro level values like democracy and pluralism and the liberal order that Germany supposedly really believes in, right? And both China and Russia are challenging this. So Germany should be taking a long, hard look again on the values that it claims to promote, and then do something about this. This is where India comes in on both these fronts, right? Because India is a great potential partner for trade purposes, absolutely, but also in the bigger scheme of things, in terms of geopolitics, in terms of global governance issues, right? And so here for India, I would say we have always said we want to be pragmatic. Now I'm saying we as India, right? As an Indian. So these are my multiple identities that may be a little bit confusing even to me. But as Indians, we tend to say, oh, we're being very pragmatic. Now we don't want to be ideological, right? And then we often find ourselves in the China camp, right? In the WTO, often we're working very closely with China. Whereas what we should be doing is we should be very proud of the values that we uphold. And those values are indeed democracy and rule of law and human rights and so on and so forth, right? And so, and this is not to say that any system is perfect or any democracy is perfect, right? Germany also has its problems. So different Hungary, EU members have their problems. So does India. But both values and secure supply chains are those two areas where India should be fairly proactive in working with Europe.
Great. Thank you, Professor Narlikar. And I'll be back with another question, another round of questions for you. But let me turn to Ambassador Navdeep Suri. And Ambassador Suri, you heard our first three speakers list some of the aspects of India's emergence, from technology to space to concerns around security, supply chains, trade, and geographies. Let me read out a statement in the essay written by Prime Minister Stephen Harper for this collection, and one statement that you have written in your essay, and then I'm going to ask you about those two statements. The first statement that Prime Minister Harper writes in his essay, that modern India has put a lie to the notion that democratic governance and economic progress are incompatible with extreme social diversity and high initial level of poverty. You in your essay say that the positions taken by India on new areas of economic diplomacy will be followed closely, not only by India's competitors, but also by its allies in the developing world. Now, what is the India story that you have shared with the world in your career over many, many decades? And what is the new story that is emerging as we look ahead in the next 25 years? What is India's new economic diplomacy architecture?
Okay, so maybe that's a very large question, but let me try to wrap my head around it. When it comes to economic diplomacy, I guess part of the thing to build on the points that were made by Professor Raji and Professor Amrita Nilekar. The Indian aid model is being looked at very carefully by a lot of countries. The Indian Development Partnership model is getting a lot of attention. And the reason is we are not China, which means that the kind of criticism that is associated with the Chinese development partnership model, where you have the debt trap diplomacy, you have the resource grab, you have money flowing into the Swiss bank accounts of select leaders, you have the undermining of governance systems. you have a pretty cavalier attitude towards environmental concerns, and to top it all, there have been serious allegations about use of prison labor in some Chinese funded projects in Africa that I've heard of. Um, so it's no wonder that Chinese assistance becomes an election issue in Zambia, or even today as we speak, the railway line that they've built in Kenya. Its viability is in question, but should the Kenyans be unable to pay back the loan, Mombasa port's ownership could be at stake. So you can understand that the kind of concern that the aggressive Chinese debt diplomacy is provoking. Now, when you talk to African leaders, and that's what I mentioned by some of our allies in the developing world, they say, well, where's the choice? We used to get Western aid, but that has diminished, and that is increasingly tied up with conditionalities, and the Chinese at least do build the infrastructure. Now, India comes in here at a very interesting point because while we are much smaller in dollar figures than the Chinese, but we are not insubstantial anymore. Our lines of credit are more than $10 billion to Africa. We offer 12,000 training slots a year. And I think the focus that we place on capacity building, the focus that we place on host countries taking ownership of the development projects. When we set up an IT center in Ghana or in Tanzania or somewhere else, part of the model is that we will not run it for more than 5 years. From the third year or fourth year onwards, the master trainers would be in place, and they would have done enough capacity building with local trainers for us to hand over the project to them for running it. And that's such a big contrast with what the Chinese are doing or what the others are doing. The dollar value for money that our assistance projects provide, I think is again one of those attractive propositions. And that's why I think as we go forward, countries like Japan and UK and even UAE are talking to India about trilateral assistance programs where we can combine, join hands with them, and perhaps deliver much more effective aid. Now, I'm not saying that our systems are perfect. I think there's a long ways to go. There's much that we can do to bridge the delivery gap. But the good news is that we are getting better at it. And I think as we get better, we are going to see that the Indian model perhaps is seen with a much greater level of interest. On Prime Minister Harper's observation about democracy and growth, I think we have demonstrated over the last 3 decades in particular that a democracy can grow, occasionally at a fairly rapid clip, occasionally with fits and starts. But I think in my conversations, I've often had to explain when people used to ask, why doesn't India do things faster or more efficiently or more effectively? I think you have to explain that, given the system, legal systems that we have, and given the democratic systems that we have, the parliamentary processes and the federal structure, we perhaps do end up paying a bit of a democracy tax. But despite paying the democracy tax, if we can still manage to grow at the speed that Amish was referring to, that we would be the world's third largest economy in a few years' time, that's not doing so badly. So there's some lessons in that for perhaps other countries.
So let me ask you something that Amrita mentioned in her intervention, the importance of values and democracy. And I think there has been some change in the recent years. And do you believe that we are more confident of using the D word in our diplomatic engagements, and we are more confident of pushing forward our own values framework? We are now in many ways setting norms on certain kinds of transactions. Do you see this change in your career span?
I have seen a change, but I'd be very careful in how I use it. I think we've done well by not being prescriptive to our friends in the developing world. I think we've done well by leading by example rather than by being prescriptive.
Evangelical about it.
We've helped build electoral institutions in a number of countries. We've helped develop constitutions in a number of countries. But we've done it fairly gently. And I think that has worked well for us. So I would certainly be very careful about talking up an Indian value system. I think let our example speak for itself, and I'd be much more comfortable with that.
It's so more by attraction, less by promotion. And I think that's the Ambassador Suri mantra for engaging on a values and pluralism framework with our neighbors and with our partners in the emerging world. Let me turn to Dr. Raja Mohan, who's, of course, I think the tallest figure in our foreign policy community. And I kept you for the last, because you would have heard all of them by now. And I am going to actually pick up two lines that I read in two different essays in this publication. One was by Harsh Pant, where he says India is shedding its past diffidence in foreign policy matters and is making bold moves in crafting partnerships for a rules-based democratic international order. The operating word, shedding its past diffidence in foreign policy. You argue, in fact, you extend this by suggesting that as a major beneficiary of economic globalization, India must actively prevent a breakdown of the international order and must do more. And having heard all of the previous speakers, what would be the Professor Raja Mohan mantra for India over the next 25 years? What bothers you with what's happening around us? And what could be India's choices at this particular moment?
Thanks, Amit. I think what you said about the diffidence, that's absolutely true. And the source of that lies in what Amish said in the beginning. The faster economic growth of India in the last 3 decades has meant India's relative weight in the international system has significantly increased. So 5th or 6th largest economy today. Yesterday, the IMF report talks about India's growing at 9% next year and 8% the following year. If we stick to that rate, if even 7%, I think India would be in a much, much better position down the road by the end of this decade. I think in the past, as Harsh talked about diffidence, we were playing cricket on the back foot when you're batting. Afraid of what the world will do to us, therefore protecting yourself from the rest of the world, shrinking your options. That was what strategic autonomy non-alignment was. But today, as our weight grows, our challenge is to really shape the international system, that you have the capacity to shape the international system and also tilt the balance between the other powers. So I think you have the capability today to do that. That is batting on the front foot. So I think that is the change. And I think we're beginning to see the consequences of this. But as we talk about India rising, we must also keep in mind India's per capita income will be pretty low for a long time to come. Therefore, even as India becomes a great power, its internal challenges of internal development, of generating prosperity for everyone will remain a big one. Just as China has had that problem, India too will have that problem. We are much, much down below. I think we should never forget that, the importance of further development and better distribution with it. In terms of the international economic system, I think we're already at a phase, Amrita talked about it, the old mantra of globalization has broken down. That we don't want, the US has walked out, for all practical purposes. China has weaponized the international economic system. So I think we have to work with our friends and partners to find a way in which reforming the existing trade system, not either keep saying globalization works for everyone, it doesn't. Therefore, finding a way to keep the core essence of the globalization process while adapting to change. So I think selective globalization, we're already seeing that. India is negotiating free trade agreements with some of its partners. I think that's a beginning, but the system has to be itself reformed. So my sense is India is put in a critical position today of both reordering the great power system by amidst the emerging confrontation between US and China, reforming the multilateral system that Amrita talked about it, and then the question of rearranging the economic order. All three, I think, for the first time, we're in a position to contribute rather than standing apart and complaining. I mean, there was a story in the old days, scholars of Indian foreign policy would say, we were always on the sidelines shouting, offside, offside, offside. But we're in the field today. We got elbows. I think we need to dribble the ball and we need to take the lead. And I think that is the big change. So for this generation of Indian scholars, of Indian policymakers, this is really an exciting time. I mean, one where we shed our diffidence and we step out and play the game rather than this holding back, always afraid to step out.
So, I asked Amrita this question, and she was quite, specific in what we could be doing at this particular time. But let me ask you that same question. What's happening in Europe today? How should India be responding to the face-off that we are witnessing around Ukraine?
Look, I think there are two outcomes possible. I mean, I'm still an optimist. A deal is still possible. I don't think at this point, I mean, Putin is not just doing this just to, go for a big blast, because he'll lose as much by simply, going into a war. And for the US, I think Biden has made it clear, look, Russia has to be respected. Russia has to be accommodated. If you go back to his press conference in June, at the end of the summit with Putin, he's saying that, look, unlike his predecessors who dismissed Russia as a declining power, he said, look, we need Russia. We'll work with Russia, given the importance of Russia for the European security. So I think there is a new realism about Russia in Washington. But unfortunately, they have to work this out in the middle through a crisis. So I think we'll see a couple of more twists. There'll be probably some more high-level summits. But in terms of rearranging the European security order is a necessity. The three great orders that were created in Europe, 1919, 1945, and 1991, none of them has endured. So therefore, today, I think Russia has to be integrated into the European security order. Russia was part of the European great power system till 1970, when the Bolshevik Revolution took place. And ever since then, Russia was sought to be excluded from the arrangements. And Russia's hope in 91 that they'll be welcomed in, that didn't turn out to be true. So therefore, I think the big question is, how do you integrate Russia into a European security order? And I think Americans, for the first time, I think, are thinking positively. But the problem, of course, is Europe is divided, deeply divided. Any accommodation with Russia, you'll see house of protests in Poland, in the Balts, and various other countries. So therefore, I think the internal contradictions of Europe. I think for a long time, we saw Europe as a settled place, as a coherent place, or a divided, between East and West. Europe has geopolitics, deep internal conflicts. I think we're beginning to see that for the first time, again, coming back into play. Therefore, my sense is there's a big moment for Europe. If they play it right, you can have a new settlement, which include Russia in the future order, and that will work for everyone, because a collapse of that order and a confrontation with Russia is going to make life a lot more miserable for us in Asia, because a US-Russia confrontation in Europe is going to give a free hand for China, and a whole lot of other consequences would certainly follow, besides the immediate incentive of how they're going to deal with Taiwan.
So, Dr. Rajamohan, I'm going to come back to you for the final word. I would like you to use the last 2 minutes to share 2 or 3 ideas for all of us to consider as we close. So I'll just stay with us and I'll be back with you. Let me turn back to Adil and actually go back to the question I asked him. With so much excitement around technology, so much connectivity, aspirations being fulfilled and being fueled in other instances, the burden of governance is certainly more. What are the governance innovations that we must be thinking about for the next 25 years?
So I wanted to plant an idea, and then I'll give some concrete examples. Today, we are talking about a big step forward, which is citizen-centric governance, right? Which is the governance that, is focused on the citizen. And, over a 20 or 30-year period, we might, in fact, see something like, governance-centric citizens, where citizens play a very important role in governance because they have access to everything and they can interface with everything. And therefore, instead of talking about citizen-centric governance, we might talk about governance-centric citizens. That'll take a while to go, but let me at least plant the idea. And let me give you a couple of examples of what I mean. On many fronts, including direct benefits transfer, the citizens' interaction with the government has changed quite a lot. Previously, most interactions of the citizen with the government used to be through their local, state, district, police forces. And, whenever they wanted to get anything from the government, they had to go to an intermediary and work with that intermediary to either get money that they are owed, scholarships that they need, payments from contractor, payments for work that was done, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And now, I think with the technology as it works, much of that interaction goes directly with the government digitally. And one example, and then when it doesn't work, we hear from them very fast. Let me give you an example. Today, if you look at the PM's portal for grievances, it gets over 100,000 complaints or grievances a month. And in a sense, the fact that it's going up, the numbers, is very good, because people believe that if they can approach the government directly, something will get done. There is a very elaborate system on ensuring that any grievance that comes is actually dealt with, and that in fact there is a response to the citizen. And if you broaden that out, any government services today has an SLA attached to it, right? A service level agreement. You will get your tax return done in so many days. You should get a refund the next number of days. If you ask a question, you should get an answer in 15 days. We never had that before. In a sense, a lot of this is a function of how we are thinking about governance in today's environment where everything is accessible all the time. So one is that the SLAs will be a lot tighter. We'll be able to track them. And in fact, you can provide government services to people very quickly. And if there's a problem, you can solve it for them. And they are not afraid of calling up to solve the problem, right? I think that's the other part, which is today there is an ability for anyone in a village who is completely illiterate to to send a video complaint to the PM's portal using a small mobile phone that costs him or her 2,000 rupees. And it will be responded to, right? So that's one thing that technology is helping in terms of the structure of the government, structure of governance, and how governance changes completely. I think the second thing is it is now becoming very possible for our elected representatives and our bureaucracy to deal directly with the citizens. You go back and see how an MLA or an MP interacted with their constituents, and you look at how they are doing it today. They are very clear that they are using digital media, they're using SMSs, they're using technology, and they want an interactive engagement with their constituents. Previously, that used to happen once in a while when you had a large rally or you're going for elections. Today, it is all the time. So I think that will change. The technology itself will help change the nature of governance. And as I said, maybe we will get to the point where we will have governance-centric citizens as opposed to citizen-centric governance. Thank you.
Thank you, Adit. Actually, let me take this point to Ambassador Navdeep Suri. Are we seeing increasingly, because of the proliferation of communication and ease of access to all of you, are we seeing diplomacy also being driven by a much larger cohort? We always used to say foreign policy and economic policy are for the elites. Are you seeing a new democratization that has taken place in terms of how we are responding to certain events and developments in the foreign domain?
Absolutely. In fact, to take Adil's argument on citizen-centric governance forward, look at the alacrity with which diplomatic missions have to respond to tweets from citizens who are facing some kind of consular or other problem in whichever part of the world. The fact that they can be able to merrily tag our foreign minister or the prime minister or whoever else and expect an answer means that the proliferation of social media has become, in a sense, a tool of empowerment for the Indian diaspora around, and it has become a means of accountability for diplomatic missions. But you also increasingly see how beyond the traditional sort of influencers on government, on foreign policy, be it think tanks, be it the media, you have politicians who are attuned to what people are saying on social media on a particular policy initiative. And I think while you can make the argument that leadership should not be driven by opinion, but the fact is that in a democracy, that opinion and that feedback loop that the social media creates does become an input into decision making and into foreign policy processes, it even starts to impact sometimes bilateral relations. If, for example, somebody has made a nasty tweet, take the case of last week on the Abu Dhabi attacks and on something that the Saudis might have said, it quickly becomes an issue that escalates. And so we are watching it real time unfold before our eyes.
And let me just remind the audience that Ambassador Navdeep Suri at one point was driving a larger engagement with the publics in terms of India's foreign policy when he was heading the public diplomacy division at the MEA. And I'm sure he would be happy with the new ecosystem that is fast emerging. Amrita, I know you need to leave, so I'm going to ask you the next question. Let me just throw a curveball at you. As India in EU and India and the West reconfigure a value-based proposition for the future, do you think some of the institutions that were the no-goes for India, for example, NATO, becomes a fair partner for the future? So should we be now shedding the shibboleths of the past and in a sense looking at new avenues? And NATO is just an example. It could be other institutions as well. It could be a more deeper integration into the Basel processes, into the G7, etc.
I love the googly. Thank you. I think this is the spot on question, and everybody just sort of skirts around it. So I'll say it as I see it. And we have seen NATO adapting and updating, right? So we had Jens Stoltenberg give a distinguished speaker lecture at the Giga, where he talked about the challenges that are being posed by China. Right. And he said, no, we don't see China as an enemy, but we do. But he talked about values. He talked about economic threats. He talked about security threats. If NATO can update, a multi-member complicated organization can update to the China challenge, surely we in India can also think about shedding some of our I think Raja is absolutely right. We're not talking the language of non-alignment, but maybe we can push ourselves a little bit more to go beyond just pragmatism and to say, well, we do have allies with shared values, right? And so I'm not expecting India to become a NATO ally, but India can certainly partner with NATO on a whole host of areas. So there are lots of measures, there are lots of cooperation arrangements that are short of a full-blown alliance. And we should certainly be thinking about this, as well as other possibilities.
Great. Thanks, Amrita, and thank you for your intervention this evening.
Thank you.
Raji, let me turn to you for your final question. And again, it's a curveball. What do you see is the role of think tanks and the scientific and research communities across the emerging and developing countries in terms of building this new ethic for the future? And this is for Dr. Rajeshwari Rajagopalan. If you heard me, Raji, perhaps this is a question you could take. How can we in think tanks create deeper linkages for the future?
Yeah, I think policy making has shifted in many ways, and I think it's no more restricted to the four walls of the MEA or MHA and MODN kind of places. Now that used to be the old ways of doing business, policy business in a sense, but I think that has changed significantly to engage a large number of stakeholders from whether it is a private sector you're talking about or a think tank community, civil society. All of them have become an important aspect, important stakeholder in the policy making business. And I think the think tanks have a particularly large role, especially when it comes to policy conversations, because on many number of issues, especially when you take up the issues of critical and emerging technologies, we are stuck at policy governance policy issues. So when you face those very difficult challenges of making different state parties come together to develop, to come into the room, debate the pros and cons of certain course of action, I think the best that you can do is to have think tank community, policy community engage in track 1.5 conversations. And I think trying to bring in different stakeholders under the same roof. And I think that's an important aspect. Second is to, of course, the policy options, the publications that think tanks produce again has an enormous value. At least you are throwing different ideas for the government to think about. You don't have to, the governments, they don't have to necessarily accept and adopt everything that the think tank writes or talks about, but at least you're throwing around different options and choices for the government to think about. And I think these are important things that I think even Indian governments, for instance, over the last decade or two, has begun to appreciate the value of engaging think tanks and so on and so forth. So I think the policy community has an important role to play, especially from sitting in the think tank world. I think there are important contributions that think tanks can make on a number of different issues, especially when it comes to policy around technologies, because I think technology is an area where private sector think tank communities are somewhat more adept in a sense in terms of the kind of challenges that we are facing, the kind of changes that we need to bring about, the kind of debates that we need to make it happen. So in a sense, on these at least, the think tank community may be slightly more at an advantageous place, and the ability to bring in different states, different stakeholders through track 1.5 sort of a deliberations, I think that's enormous in value in this regard.
Thank you, Raji. Let me turn to Dr. Raja Mohan for the final time this evening for his final intervention. One question, and sir, your thoughts as we close. The question to you is, some would argue that in the last decade, the track one community, the policy community, has been ahead of the curve, and the think tanks have been far more conservative. Gone are those days when we used to be the originators of dramatic ideas. I think the political class does it much better than us today. So how do we reinvent the policy thinking going ahead? How do we continue to be ambitious as institutions? But how do you sum up what you heard today and from the volume that we have co-produced with all of you?
Yeah. So I'll just briefly state 4 or 5 things. I think one, what Adil talked about, the importance of technology, and then what Amish started with, India's relative weight going up in the international system. I think both these need to be combined to change the lives of our people. I think that should be the first task of the state. So the accelerating internal development using both technology as well as India's new international leverages, I think that is really the first proposition. The second, I think, is when we talk about India at 75, India's independence tragically was also associated with India's partition. I think we didn't go too much into it, but I think the bitter legacies of partition, I think they endure on a range of issues. We don't have to go into the detail, but the fact is those legacies need to be addressed. I think that that becomes very, very important. The third aspect, I would say, India began its foreign policy in 75 years ago with an emphasis on Asia, but we really didn't succeed. But today, I think 2 new geographies that have come, the Indo-Pacific, which is broader than Asia and the Indian Ocean. Then you have Eurasia. On both these, with India's increased weight, today I think we have a much better opportunity to shape both these regions. And I think how we do this is an exciting venture, I think, for all of the next generation of policymakers. Then we also talked about rejigging the global order, both economic as well as strategic, rearranging multilateralism. Here, one of the new things that has happened is minilateralism. We briefly mentioned Quad. So it's not just doing everything in Geneva or Vienna, but I think it is like-minded countries coming together and shaping the evolution, whether it's on climate change, or whether it is on digital rules, which you have worked quite a bit on that, or even space, for example. Many of these new domains, new rules are going to be written. The Chinese exploration on moon, for example, the American Artemis program. Who is going to write the rules for exploitation of outer space? So I think we need to be a lot more actively involved in reshaping global domains. ORF has done a lot of work on space, on cyber. These issues where India needs to more actively, positively participate to set new rules. So I think this is a rich agenda for us. And here I would say the last thought, that think tanks, there's always a danger of falling into groupthink. So what is conventional is great. So therefore, don't challenge any. And then the second problem is, let's stay 10 feet behind the governments so that you're not upsetting anyone or you don't take any risks. It's easier to be, and it's not a problem in India. I would say, look at the US. Not one thing that Biden has done was predicted by any of the massive think tank industry in Washington. So I think it is not the size of it. A lot of people say, oh, Washington has fantastic industry, but they miserably failed to tell us about Trump. They've not told us about Biden. So I think there is the danger of becoming, like in Washington, the revolving door. Of course, people go in and come out. So you want to be in a bandwidth that will get you the next job. But I think the advantage of being in the think tank industry is to question the principle. It doesn't have to be adversarial or critical always. But I think the ability to show alternative options, which is what Rajiv was talking about. The scale of the policy-making challenges in India is so broad. The government structure is not alone, in a position to produce those changes. So I think you already seen on climate change, on a lot of issues where ORF itself has made major contributions. So I think there is a huge, exciting field for all those of us in think tanks to contribute to policymaking, not in, as wanting, look, we don't want to be sitting inside the government and running things, but I think the role outside is going to be far more exciting in a way that we can bring together a lot more diverse inputs. But I would say for anyone, for the younger people, you have a large number of young people, today in India, for them, this is really an exciting moment. I think this is not the India we grew up in. We were always defensive, we were always hesitant, but today I think the opportunities for the new India are enormous. And it's really going to be wonderful to be representing India and dealing for India with the rest of the world.
Thank you, Dr. Raja Mohan. I think those are important words. India at 75 and the future beckons. The Gen Next is an opportunity to write newer scripts and indeed discover newer pathways for development growth and for their individual aspirations as well. Let me thank all the panelists for their wonderful interventions. And let me turn it back to Amish, a wonderful host, for his final words as we close this evening. And my apologies, we ran 5 minutes over our schedule. Amish, over to you.
Thanks, Samir. This was a fascinating discussion. I think the audience learned a lot. One could see from the participation and the questions. Samir, it's a fantastic volume that you put together. So if any member of the audience wants to get this book, this volume, how can they source it?
Please come to our website. It's the banner volume. You just land on our website and download it. It's in PDF and in HTML format, www.orfonline.org. This is going to be up for the next few days. Please make full use of the resource.
Okay, so it's free of cost and royalty free. As an author, that truly scares me. But it's but it's wonderful.
Maybe start having the viewership you get for your publication, we will probably think about pricing. But no, as a public institution, all our material is available to all audiences.
Well, it was a wonderful discussion. Thank you so much, Samir, for putting this together. Professor Raja, Adilji, Ambassador Suri, Rajeshwari, thank you so much for joining this platform. Amrita had to leave earlier, but I hope she can hear us. Thank you so much. This was a wonderful event, and look forward to many more such discussions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Happy Republic Day.
Happy Republic Day.